There's a sentence that appears in almost every biography of the Queen Mother, and it's always phrased the same way. She held views typical of her generation. That sentence is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because the views that were typical of her generation include specific comments documented by staff about race, immigration, and the people who served her. Let me read you what she actually said, but first, the sentence itself, because the sentence is its own story. And the story it tells isn't really about one old woman in a tiara. It's about who got erased, who got talked about at dinner tables they'd never be invited to sit at, who got turned away from jobs they were qualified for, in writing, on palace letterhead, because of what they looked like. The Queen Mother's words were never just words. They lived inside an institution. They shaped hiring policies. They determined who was visible and who was invisible in the rooms where power actually operated. So when biographers reached for that soft little sentence, views typical of her generation, they weren't just protecting her. They were burying the experience of every Black person those views touched. When Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon died on the 30th of March, 2002, at the age of 101, every major British outlet published an obituary. The Guardian ran theirs on the 1st of April. The Telegraph ran theirs. The BBC aired retrospective programming, and in each of those pieces, her views on race were handled identically, not similarly, identically. A product of her time, attitudes common to her class and era, views shaped by her Edwardian upbringing. The phrasing varied by a word or two, but the function was always the same. Acknowledge that something existed, then physically prevent the audience from seeing what it was. One outlet says it, that's an editorial choice. Two outlets say it, that's a coincidence. Every single outlet saying it, using interchangeable language across decades, that's a protocol. And the protocol held. Hugo Vickers published his biography, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, through Arrow Books in 2005. He acknowledged her views reflected her upbringing and class. He didn't present the specific evidence that might let the reader judge for themselves. William Shawcross published the official biography through Macmillan in 2009. Over 900 pages, palace-authorized access to private correspondence, the royal archives, members of her household speaking under palace approval. Over 900 pages, the most comprehensive account of her life ever produced. And on the question of what she actually said about race, largely absent, not confronted and contextualized, not explored and evaluated, just missing. Like a room erased from a house plan, The Guardian's review, published on the 24th of October, 2009, noted that Shawcross, as he trudges through the second half of her life, found that one decade glided into another. The Times noted in September 2009 that Shawcross had been forced to defend himself against charges that his official biography of the Queen Mother was a whitewash. Over 900 pages of palace-authorized access, and the word whitewash is the one that stuck. So that's the pattern. Biographers gather the evidence. Biographers acknowledge the evidence exists. Biographers then withhold that evidence from the reader and replace it with a euphemistic summary. Every single time. And every single time, the people most affected by those views, the Black staff who served in those households, the Black immigrants whose presence she found alarming, the Black Africans whose capacity for self-governance she openly denied, are rendered invisible twice. Once by the views themselves, and again by the biographers who decided you didn't need to hear them. Which brings us to the evidence they're withholding. Exhibit A. The Woodrow Wyatt Diaries. Woodrow Wyatt, Baron Wyatt of Weeford, died on the 7th of December 1997 at the age of 79. He'd been a Labour member of Parliament who drifted rightward across his career, became one of Margaret Thatcher's closest confidants and, this is the part that matters, was a regular dining companion and intimate friend of the Queen Mother. For decades. They socialized at dinner parties, weekend house gatherings, private occasions throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. He recorded their conversations in exhaustive detail. Not to expose her. He adored her. He recorded them because he was a compulsive diarist who recorded everything. His journals were published posthumously in 2 volumes as The Journals of Woodrow Wyatt, edited by Sarah Curtis, the first volume released by Macmillan in 1998. And they were published posthumously for a reason, because the subjects of those journals, the Queen Mother among them, would almost certainly never have permitted their release during their lifetimes. Here's what Wyatt documented. According to his published journals, the Queen Mother told him she was horrified by the scale of Commonwealth immigration to Britain. She didn't frame this as a nuanced policy concern about housing or infrastructure. She didn't couch it in the language of economic anxiety or public services. The Independent, reporting on the 6th of June 2017, cited the published diaries in noting she'd told Wyatt she found the transformation of British cities by immigration deeply alarming. Think about what that means in concrete terms. The people she found alarming were the Windrush generation and their children, the men and women who'd come from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and across the Caribbean at the explicit invitation of the British government. They'd come to drive the buses, staff the hospitals, rebuild a country shattered by a war the Queen Mother was celebrated for enduring alongside them. And she found their presence in British cities horrifying. Wyatt recorded her position on newly independent African nations as equally blunt. She expressed the view, repeatedly and without equivocation, that Black Africans were not capable of governing themselves, that the departure of white colonial administration from the continent was a catastrophe, not a liberation. Consider the sweep of that statement. By the time she was expressing these views in the 1980s, the African independence movements of the 1950s and 1960s had produced nations that had been governing themselves for decades. These weren't theoretical nations. They were countries with parliaments, universities, poets, engineers, doctors. Countries whose citizens had fought for freedom at extraordinary cost. And the Queen Mother's position, expressed to Wyatt across multiple conversations at multiple gatherings over multiple years, was that all of it was a mistake. That Black people needed white people to run things for them. Not a one-off remark at a bad dinner party, a settled worldview. The Guardian's observer, reviewing the Wyatt diaries and the social world they documented, recalled a weekend house party at which he'd recorded her conversation alongside other grandees of the conservative establishment. These weren't whispered confessions. They were ordinary after-dinner talk among a class that regarded its racial assumptions as self-evident truths. And here's what might be the most damning detail of all. Wyatt didn't flag the comments as remarkable. He didn't add an editorial note of surprise or discomfort. He didn't express shock. He just wrote down what she said and moved on to the next entry. The diarist didn't think it was notable. That's how normalized these views were in her circle. Black people's capacity for civilization was discussed with the same casual confidence as the weather or the horses. Exhibit B. Sir Roy Strong and the comment that was too awful. Sir Roy Strong, former director of both the National Portrait Gallery and the Victoria and Albert Museum, was a prominent figure in the cultural establishment and a regular in the Queen Mother's social orbit. Like Wyatt, a lifelong diarist. His published diaries span decades of British cultural and social life. They include gossip, cruelty, snobbery, and pettiness from dozens of public figures. He committed all manner of indiscretion and social savagery to print. That was his entire literary project. Candid, unvarnished social history. On the 6th of June 2017, The Independent reported that Strong had recorded in his diaries a racist comment made by the Queen Mother that he described, in his own editorial note, as too awful to include in the published text. Stop there. Sit with that for a moment. A man who had published the petty cruelties and private embarrassments of the British cultural establishment for decades, who had never before flinched at committing uncomfortable truths to print, encountered a single comment by the Queen Mother about race and decided the public couldn't handle it. He noted its existence. He noted his own shock. He did not reproduce the words. Too awful is doing the same work as views typical of her generation. It acknowledges evidence exists. It physically prevents you from seeing it. Even in the act of suppression, though, Strong confirmed the nature of what was said. It was racist. It was specific. It was bad enough to shock a man who'd spent decades in the company of the British upper class. A man, in other words, with a very high threshold for aristocratic ugliness. Whatever she said about black people in that moment cleared a bar that decades of documented snobbery and casual cruelty couldn't reach. And we'll never know what it was, because the same impulse that drives biographers to write views typical of her generation drove Strong to write, too awful. The words get swallowed. The people those words were about get erased from the record. Again. Exhibit C. The vocabulary. Multiple published sources, converging independently, document the specific words the Queen Mother used to refer to black people. The terms most consistently attributed to her are blackamoors, an archaic word from the Elizabethan era, carrying connotations of racial otherness and exoticism, positioning black people as decorative curiosities, and the slur, nignogs. These attributions don't come from a single hostile source. They come from a pattern across staff accounts, political commentary, and social acquaintances. In April 2002, days after her death on the 30th of March, the Socialist Worker published an assessment of her legacy, stating plainly, the Queen Mother referred to black people as nignogs, or blackamoors. The same piece stated she opposed immigration and thought black Africans incapable of governing themselves. The Independent's 2017 reporting corroborated the pattern, noting her documented history of racist remarks as reported across diarists, staff, and social acquaintances. Lady Colin Campbell, the Jamaican-born socialite and author of several books on the royal family, has written about the racial attitudes pervading the Queen Mother's circle, drawing on her own proximity to the aristocratic world where these views circulated without consequence. Because the only people in the room were people who agreed, or people who served the drinks. Blackamoors is a particularly telling word choice. It's not a common modern slur. It's drawn from a much older vocabulary of racial hierarchy, a word from the era of Shakespeare, used when black people in England were literal curiosities at court, objects of fascination, things to be displayed. The word connects her language directly to the imperial worldview she was born into at Glamis Castle in Angus, as the daughter of the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, raised in Edwardian aristocracy where the British Empire wasn't understood as a system of extraction and domination, but as a civilizing mission, a benevolent hierarchy where each race occupied its natural station. She was still using this language in the 1980s and 1990s. Let that land. Because here's what product of her time requires you to ignore. She lived through every time. Born on the 4th of August, 1900, died on the 30th of March, 2002. 101 years. She witnessed the entire arc of the 20th century's racial reckoning and chose, at every single turning point, not to turn. She was alive for the American Civil Rights Movement, alive for decolonization, for the Race Relations Act of 1968, for the Brixton Uprising of 1981. She saw the Windrush generation raise children and grandchildren on British soil, She saw the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in 1999. She saw the McPherson report identify institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police. She saw multicultural Britain become demographic reality for over half a century. Her views didn't evolve, not across 7 decades of massive social change. Not once. Product of her time works as a defense if someone dies in 1945. She died in 2002. Her time was everyone's time. She simply refused to live in it. Now, the institution. Because this wasn't just one woman saying ugly things at dinner. On the 2nd of June, 2021, The Guardian published an investigation that moved the story from the personal to the structural. Reporters David Pegg and Rob Evans revealed documents held at the National Archives showing Buckingham Palace had operated an explicit policy banning, and the word banning comes from the documents themselves, not from interpretation, colored immigrants or foreigners from serving in clerical roles in the royal household. That phrase appeared in the palace's own paperwork, written down, not informal, not implied, documented, filed, and operationalized. Think about what those words meant for a Black person in Britain during the 1950s or 1960s. You might be perfectly qualified. You might be a British subject from Jamaica or Nigeria or Guyana. You might have come to Britain because Britain itself asked you to come. And when you applied for a clerical position at the palace, a typing job, a filing job, the kind of respectable civil service adjacent work that the Windrush generation aspired to, you were rejected. Not because of your skills, not because of your experience, because the policy said colored immigrants or foreigners. Those were the categories, written in ink, on palace paper. The Guardian reported the practice was in place until at least the late 1960s. But when the Race Relations Act 1968 arrived, legislation that was supposed to prohibit exactly this kind of racial discrimination in employment, the palace didn't comply. It negotiated. It secured for itself a carve-out, an exemption ensuring its employees couldn't bring complaints of racial discrimination to an employment tribunal. Complaints were instead routed through an internal process, with the palace's own senior official, the keeper of the privy purse, acting as point of contact. The palace effectively became its own judge and jury on matters of racial discrimination in employment. Time magazine confirmed in April 2023 that this exemption persisted through successive pieces of legislation and was ultimately folded into the Equality Act 2010. Al Jazeera covered it. The Root covered it. Business Insider covered it. The details were consistent across every outlet. People of color were formally excluded from certain employment categories within the royal household, and the institution then insulated itself from legal accountability for that exclusion. For decades. So, a Black employee at Buckingham Palace who experienced racial discrimination at work, who was passed over for promotion, who heard a slur from a senior household member, who was steered away from visible roles, had no recourse to an employment tribunal, no access to the same legal protections that applied to every other workplace in Britain. Their only option was to complain to the palace itself. About the palace. This is the institutional context the Queen Mother's vocabulary existed inside. She lived at Clarence House from 1953 until her death in 2002, served by a household whose composition reflected the broader palace culture. William Tallon, her page of the presence from 1978, who joined her staff as a footman in 1960 and served for over 50 years until her death, operated within this structure. Major Colin Burgess, who served as her equerry and later published Behind Palace Doors in 2006, described a household that was insular, hierarchical, and rooted in traditions that hadn't been examined or updated in decades. The racial composition of her household, the roles that were available to whom, the visible and invisible hierarchies of domestic service, all of this existed within a system that had formally excluded people on the basis of race. In writing, when she used those words, She wasn't just expressing personal prejudice. She was the most senior figure in a household embedded within an institution that had turned prejudice into employment practice. Her language and the palace's policies weren't separate problems. They were the same problem, operating at different scales. And here's the contrast that makes all of it worse. She served as patron or president of over 300 organizations during her lifetime. Many were connected to charitable work in or about Commonwealth nations, the association of nations that emerged from the British Empire, the majority of whose citizens are people of color. She toured the Caribbean. She toured Africa. She toured South Asia, photographed at every stop smiling warmly, receiving flowers from children, engaging local dignitaries with the practiced graciousness she was celebrated for. In 1947, she accompanied King George VI on the royal tour of South Africa, an extended visit that took place as the apartheid system was being formally constructed. The National Party would win the following year's election and begin codifying racial segregation into law. Picture the split screen. On one side, the Queen Mother accepting bouquets from black children in the Caribbean, smiling for cameras, the gracious face of a monarchy that claimed to embrace its Commonwealth family. On the other, nignogs, blackamoors, not capable of governing themselves. Same person, same lifetime, same decades. This wasn't a contradiction she struggled with. There's no evidence she experienced it as tension at all. The public performance and the private contempt coexisted perfectly, because in her worldview, they weren't contradictory. You could smile at the natives and still believe they needed you to run things. That's what empire was. Benevolent condescension with a photogenic smile. And the black people on the other side of that smile? They didn't get to read the Wyatt diaries. They didn't hear what was said at the dinner parties after they left the room. They experienced the institution, its hiring bans, its exemptions from equality law, its careful management of who was visible and who was not, without ever seeing the private vocabulary that animated it. The euphemism machine didn't just protect the Queen Mother from the public. It protected the institution from the people it excluded. This connects to something more recent, something the audience remembers. In March 2021, Meghan Markle told Oprah Winfrey that an unnamed member of the royal family had expressed concerns and conversations about how dark her son Archie's skin might be when he was born. Meghan didn't name the person. Prince Harry confirmed the conversation had happened. Neither named the family member. The revelation provoked a global response, but it was characterized almost universally as shock, as though racial prejudice within the royal family were a surprising new development rather than a documented feature of its culture stretching back generations. That's the same machine, different decade, same protocol. Acknowledge something exists. Ensure the public never sees the specifics. Prince Philip's racial comments are exhaustively documented, a decades-long catalog of remarks to a British student in China, Aboriginal Australians, and others that were treated by the British press as lovable gaffes, rather than what they plainly were. Princess Michael of Kent wore a blackamoor brooch to a Christmas lunch at which she was meeting Meghan Markle for the first time. The Queen Mother's views weren't aberrant within this family. They were foundational. The attitudes documented in the Wyatt diaries didn't die with her. They became the cultural water the family swam in. And when Meghan described the concern about Archie's skin color, she was describing a current in that water, not a new phenomenon. But the biographers knew all of this. That's what makes their choices indefensible. The Wyatt diaries were published in 1998, sitting right there in print, unfiltered, available to anyone with a library card. The Strong diaries documented a comment the author himself called too awful to publish. Staff testimony circulated. Lady Colin Campbell wrote about it. The record existed. Scattered across multiple sources, yes, but there if you wanted to look. And every biographer looked. They had to. It's their job. Shawcross had palace-authorized access to the people who knew her best, the ladies-in-waiting, the equerries, the household officials. He was uniquely positioned to ask what she said, what she meant, whether her views changed as the decades passed and the world around her transformed. His over 900-page biography doesn't indicate he did so, and because he was writing with palace cooperation, his editorial choices carry institutional weight. What the official biography chose not to say represents the version of the Queen Mother's life the royal household wanted preserved for the historical record. That version doesn't include the word blackamoor, doesn't include the Wyatt dinner conversations, doesn't include Roy Strong's "too awful" comment, doesn't include any of it. And it doesn't include the black people those words were aimed at, the immigrants, the staff, the African leaders, the Commonwealth citizens who existed in her private conversation only as objects of contempt. The Wyatt diaries are the exception that proves the rule. They escaped the filter because they were published posthumously, without palace cooperation or approval, and because Wyatt wasn't writing a royal biography. He was recording his own life, and the Queen Mother happened to be in it. The editorial apparatus that softened every other account didn't apply to his journals, which is exactly why the filtered version collapses. The biographers weren't lacking evidence, they were choosing not to use it. And in making that choice, repeatedly, uniformly, using nearly identical language, they chose the comfort of the institution over the dignity of the people the institution harmed. This pattern isn't historical. It's active. Right now, today, producers are commissioning documentaries about the royal family. Writers are drafting retrospectives. Editors are reviewing copy. And when they reach the Queen Mother's views on race, they reach for the same sentence. She held views typical of her generation. They reach for it because everyone before them reached for it, and because reaching for it is easier than quoting the Wyatt diaries, easier than explaining what blackamoors means, easier than acknowledging that the palace's own employment documents used the phrase colored immigrants or foreigners in writing to describe who couldn't hold certain jobs, easier than reckoning with what it meant to be a black person trying to build a life in a country whose most beloved grandmother privately found your presence horrifying. That sentence, views typical of her generation, isn't description. It's a decision, made fresh every time by people who have access to the same published sources you just heard. And every time they make that decision, they erase the same people twice. Once from the Queen Mother's dinner table, and once from the historical record. Now you know what those views were. Now you know what that sentence has been replacing. And the next time you hear it in a documentary, and you will hear it, you'll know exactly what it's protecting, and exactly who it's failing. If this is the kind of history you think deserves to be told straight, subscribe. More stories like this are coming.